So we're moving into the depths of the cognitive science of meaning and the meaning crisis. And last time we took a look at how all of the machinery of relevance realization generates the different aspects of meaning. I gave you the schematic diagram, which I'm not going to repeat right now, but then I used it as a basis for talking further about the psychotechnologies in mythos, and we unpacked those, and then we talked about sacredness, where mythos is used in order to represent, to symbolize, to put into story, where mythos is about religio itself, where you have the significance of significance when mythos is being used to try and enhance and enrich religio itself. That gives us the sacredness landscape. And then we took a look at what happens when that landscape is under attack or threatened. And we took a look at the issue of domicide, and we saw what happened in domicide when religio and its supportive sacred landscape is threatened. And what we saw while we were doing that is one of the functions of sacredness is to afford worldview attunement. This bidirectional modeling between agent and arena turns individuals into agents, actors with a guide plan for action, and it turns the world into arena, a meaningfully structured place in which their actions find a resonant place. And so you have this agent arena dynamic that is set up, and this worldview attunement is a meta-meaning system that affords that basic fundamental fittedness of relevance realization that grounds all the other specific meaning systems in a particular culture. But I pointed out that while that is an important function of sacredness, that assimilation function, that consoling and protective function, sacredness has had another, what appears to be diametrically opposite function. And we took a look, in contrast to Geertz's notion of worldview attunement, we took a look at Otto's notion of the encountering the numinous, the mystery, and we talked about what a mystery is and how it's different from a problem, that trajectory of transframing. It's right, and it's fascinating because of the way in which it opens up, where cognition, it sort of trains the insight machinery, the flow machinery. But it is also terrifying precisely because it exposes us to that which is beyond our framing. It exposes us to the fact that reality is ultimately fundamentally other, because reality in itself is combinatorially explosive. And so we took a look at the kinds of patterns that we're going to most like. The kinds of patterns we're going to most like within the sacredness landscape are those that afford the back and forth, this opponent processing between the assimilating meta-meaning of worldview attunement and the accommodating meta-meaning of the numinous. And then I proposed to further extend this analysis of trying to get more into what sacredness is and religio is by seeing how they break down, by looking at a more broad scale form or instance of domicide that affected an entire civilization. And we took a look at the Hellenistic period, the post-Alexander period, that is in very many ways similar to ours. And we noted the kind of effects that were going on, how people were responding to it. There was the creation of new religions like syncretism. There were the beginnings of something that was going to become Gnosticism, a sort of mythos of escape. We saw the rise of mother goddess figures like Isis. But at the very end of the class, I pointed to something that is perhaps more relevant to us now, and also more relevant for us understanding Buddhism and its potential connection with cognitive science. And that was a transformation in the notion of philosophy that took place during the Hellenistic period. And this was the transformation of the philosopher into the physician of the soul, where there's an important therapeutic aspect to being a philosopher, that a philosopher's job was to alleviate suffering, specifically the suffering that was becoming pervasive, the anxiety and so forth that was pervasive in the Hellenistic period of domicide. And I believe that is where we have gotten to. Is that correct? What I want to do is continue to examine that in more detail by looking one specific instance and then having that in dialogue with modern psychology. And then I want to open this up and look at what issues of domicile and related events reveal to us about what happens, what are the perennial problems facing our perspectival existence that are often brought to the fore and left unaddressed or unameliorated when we do not have a sacredness landscape. So part of what I'm going to concentrate on today are the perennial problems and some of the psychotechnologies that have addressed them. And then we will take a look at the interaction in the last class between these perennial problems, the historical factors, and how both Buddhism and cognitive science together can address the perennial problems and the historical factors. So that's the agenda. I know it sounds grandiose, and perhaps the gods will strike me dead, but I'm going to try my best. All right, so there are many different schools of Hellenistic philosophy, but I'm going to pick one, I think for some very good reasons. One, it is the one most often compared to Buddhism. It is the Western form of philosophy most often compared to Buddhism. Second, it is a form of Western philosophia. That's what I'm going to call it to distinguish it from modern academic philosophy. It's a form of Western philosophia that has had a huge impact on current cognitive psychology. Specifically therapeutic impact through the cognitive therapies, cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive therapy. All of these cognitive-based therapies have directly been influenced by this philosophia. Thirdly, this philosophia is going through a significant revival right now. So the form of philosophia I want to talk about is Stoicism. Stoicism. Now, most of you only know, I think you're learning a very general lesson, the way our culture tends to trivialize and degrade the meaning of things, given enough time. So most of you think the word Stoic means sort of stiff upper lip, no emotions, things like that. That is not actually, that is a misrepresentation, in fact, a caricature of what Stoicism is. So Stoicism directly comes out of Socrates, but we talked about this before. There's two great disciples of Socrates, Plato, and we've sort of done Plato to death, right? And then there's Antisthenes. And he didn't write anything. He thought that Socrates' philosophy was not to be captured in theoretical argumentation, but in a transformed way of living. So when they were asked, when he was asked by his compatriots and contemporaries, what did you most learn from Socrates? You're not writing anything like Plato is. This is what he said. He said, I learned how to converse with myself. I learned how to dialogue with myself. Now, most of you can say, well, big deal, I talk to myself all day long. And it's pretty useless, and I find it kind of insane and annoying, and I wish I could stop it a lot of the time. That's not what Antisthenes means. He doesn't mean the mental chatter in your head where you babble to yourself all day long. What he means, and this becomes very clear in the history of Stoicism, is he learned how to internalize Socrates. He learned how to take Socratic elenchus, that Socratic dialogue that creates aporia, that really triggers second-order thinking. He learned how to internalize Socrates. And we've talked about how that kind of perspectival knowing, where you internalize another person in order to self-transcend. So what Antisthenes was saying was he learned how to internalize Socratic elenchus so that he could self-transcend, self-transform. And that self-transcending self-transformation was what he thought the key thing about Socrates that needed to be emulated. So Antisthenes was the teacher of Diogenes, who you all know is famous. Diogenes was a Cynic philosopher. Cynicism is also a word that has degraded to mean someone who believes there's no ultimate values and is only sort of manipulating things for an ulterior motive of self-aggrandizement or something like that. So Donald Trump is sort of the epitome of cynicism. That's not what cynicism means. That's not what its primary philosophy was. Cynicism was, right, to try and enact as much as possible this process of Socratic self-transformation and self-transcendence. What the Cynics did is they started this model of, right, the philosopher as a physician of the soul, as the doctor of the psyche. So what they did is they tried to diagnose the anxiety that was pervasive in the time, in the Hellenistic era. And then they tried to, after providing a diagnosis, they provided a prognosis, right? What to be done. And the diagnosis was the following. People were suffering because they were setting their hearts upon, identifying with, getting identified with man-made, human-made institutions and customs, human-made structures of society and principles. And so what the Cynics thought was they needed to constantly challenge those human-made, right, convention and principles, precisely because they did not have the status they claimed. What the Cynics argued was people experienced anxiety because they identified with things that were fundamentally not, right, permanent, that didn't have a lasting status, that were doomed to being challenged and overthrown. Because this, of course, was what the pluralism of the Hellenistic era was showing. You may believe in this whole set of customs, right, and this whole principles and all these conventions, and this is a way of living, and then here's a group of people living next door to you that have a completely different alternative set, right? And so what the Cynics did was try to show people how, they tried to make a distinction and show in their actions how to realize this distinction, not intellectually, but Socratically. And the distinction is between, and we've talked about this before, between purity codes and moral codes. So what the Cynics thought is that moral codes were universal. I'm not saying they're correct on this, I'm explaining the argument. Although they seem to have been, right, precursors to our ideas of something like universal, human rights, human dignity. And insofar as we think there is legitimacy to that idea, then we agree with the Cynics that, right, we can make a fundamental distinction between moral codes and purity codes. And the argument was that purity codes were based on people's pursuits of power and status. The main move the Cynics were making, to use the language of the course, is to say that most of the social codes and the purity codes that people were living by were pre-axially based, were based on power and fame and glory and status. And what they were espousing were the axial values of morality and virtue, and also natural law. They thought that the things that really mattered were the laws that governed, right, the universe, and moral principles. Those were the two things, and the only two things that human beings should identify with. So Diogenes would famously do things to try and provoke people to see through, right, to use some of the language of the course, the bullshit that they had fallen prey to, the supersalience of their pervasive ethnocentric and culturocentric biases. So he famously, you know this, it actually became a card in the tarot deck. He went around Athens carrying a lamp, and then Led Zeppelin used it for one of their albums, right? And the older ones in the room know what album I'm talking about, and the rest of you will have to drift, not knowing about Led Zeppelin. Okay, so it's the man carrying the lamp. Look, so he went into the agora where you went to look for whatever you wanted. This is the marketplace, and he's carrying a lamp around him. People sort of stopped him and asked him, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm looking for an honest man. And he's carrying a lamp around to try and show that there's a kind of darkness even during the day, and something that's very hard to find that he really wants to find, an honest man, can't be found in the midst of all the marketplace. So he would do things like that. Alexander came to visit Diogenes because Diogenes did not live in Athens in a house. He lived outside Athens in a barrel because he wanted to live as naturally, as independently from human society and its social constructs that he possibly could. So Alexander came to visit Diogenes. So here's Alexander, the emperor of the world. He's walking up to talk to Diogenes. He's got it. And Alexander was always creating these set pieces. He was always creating these moments where he would reveal how godlike he was, right? You know, he cuts the Gordian knot and he rides the unrideable horse and blah and blah and blah. So he's obviously setting this great stage, right? He's going to say, and he comes up to Diogenes and he says, I am Alexander, I can give you whatever you want. What do you want? And Diogenes says, could you move a little to the left? You're blocking my sunlight. Okay. And Alexander, this is one of the few stories we have of where Alexander is sort of like, he falls off script. He doesn't know what to do because Alexander's working within this whole script of glory and power, and Diogenes just goes whoosh around it. Now, we sort of like Diogenes when he does stuff like that, but you wouldn't like everything Diogenes did. And to try and make you remember, or sorry, experience what it would be like to be a contemporary of Diogenes, I'll show you some of the other things that aren't so pleasant. Diogenes came into the center of the marketplace, dropped his pants, and masturbated in front of everybody. Now, most of you wouldn't like it if somebody did this around you. Why is he doing this? Because he's trying to point out that in the marketplace where people are lying and cheating and stealing from each other, that's okay, but doing this thing that isn't harming anybody and is perfectly natural is really the cause of much scorn and disgust. So what the Cynics are constantly doing is it's almost like this performance art of trying to reveal to us how absurd our identification processes are, how we identify with the social constructs that are given to us, right, in terms of purity codes that are wrapped around the pursuits of power and fame, etc. So Diogenes taught a guy by the name of Crates, and then there's this guy who gets shipwrecked on the shores of Athens. His name is Zeno, not the Zeno who created all the paradoxes, a different Zeno. And Zeno reads lots of Plato, but he also becomes a student of Crates. Now, Crates does exactly the opposite of Diogenes. So whereas Diogenes went out and sort of really antagonizes everybody, Crates went out and did sort of unrelenting acts of compassion and kindness to reveal to people. He's almost like a Jesus figure to reveal to people the absurdity of their commitments and their identifications. So Zeno picks up this and picks up this. And Zeno is the founder of Stoicism. The Stoa was a covered colonnade in Athens where he would walk up and down and give his lessons. Okay? Now, he was deeply impressed by Plato, and he thought, while he was very influenced by Cynicism, he wanted to bring back important aspects of Plato that he thought the Cynics had lost. So basically, the Stoics agree with the Cynics that the cause of our problems is our process of identification, which I'll unpack in a minute or two. Our process of identification, what we're identifying with, how we're identifying ourselves, how we're identifying objects in the world, that's the crucial thing. But unlike the Cynics, they thought the problem wasn't what we were identifying with, but how we were identifying. And so what the Stoics said is, the Cynics thought the problem was we were identifying with the wrong things. The Stoics said, no, and this is, think about how much this corresponds to what we've talking about this course. It's not what, it's how. It's how, right, you're identifying that was the crucial problem. And the Stoics thought that the retreat from society and the retreat from political engagement was a mistake. And the Stoics made the argument that humans are by nature social, political, and cultural beings. And the attempt to live like animals is actually self-destructive. That our true training in virtue has to be done in a social manner. So what they focused on, and this is the crucial move, and this is always one of the crucial moves, right, is they concentrated not so much on what's being identified with, but how. And so the Stoics are a significant advocate of bringing, right, a kind of rationality to the Cynic process of questioning our identification process. So what the Stoics basically did is said, the identification process is the fundamental way in which we're making meaning. And the Stoics are the first ones to get really crystal clear on this. And they are the ones that make the first explicit and clear distinction between events and the meanings we assign to events. They really get it. They really pull the two apart for the first time really super clearly. So they really bring that whole axial age thrust to a point of like quite crystal clarity. And what our argument is what we care about and what affects our emotions and our minds, right, is the meaning of things much, much more often than the things themselves. And what we do is, it's not this object or that object, like the Cynics said, it's that we focus too much on the things and not on the meaning that we are giving things. So let's try and pick this apart a little bit, like pull it apart and examine it, right? So according to the Stoics, what we're doing too often is we're conflating together meaning and the event, or meaning and the thing. We see it as just one unified entity. Right? And we think we are responding to this when the Stoics say what we're actually responding to most of the time is that, the meaning. And this is what they mean about concentrating on the how rather than the what. In a sense, the Cynics are still making a mistake. They still think the problem is a particular object or event. The Stoics are going meta. They're going much more explicit and clear. The problem isn't any particular event or object. The problem is confusing and confounding the meaning with the object or the event itself. Now, those of you who have some familiarity with cognitive behavioral therapy, in fact, with a lot of therapy, will note that this is the pivotal therapeutic moment. The pivotal therapeutic insight is to get people to separate the meaning they're giving something from the thing. Because as long as the two are fused together, you cannot help them. Because very often the events can't be altered. The things can't be changed. One primary example is the events have occurred in the past. Yes?
What do you mean by the items being tied together? As in, you can't pull apart considerations of what the item is as opposed to its meaning?
What I mean is, I think something like that, but I'm not quite clear what you're saying, Alex, is that we tend to think we are responding to the properties of the object as opposed to properties, right, that we have, that the object has in relation to us, the meaning we are attributing to it. Is that answering your question?
I think what I'm trying to ask is, prior to Stoicism, were considerations of meaning and a thing inherently the same? Was there no such thing as different people having?
No. No, what I'm claiming is the axial revolution has started to pull those apart from the beginning, and it has tried to distinguish them. But the Stoics take this, and they, rather it being sort of an implicit background principle, they make it a foreground explicit claim that's central. So I think in that sense, they're explicating and bringing to a kind of clearness and clarity, a fundamental principle that has been running through the whole axial revolution. Did that answer your question? Okay. How does this confounding and conflating occur? Okay. Well, it's this co-identification process. We've been talking about this from the beginning, the way we are fitted, right? Relevance, realization, religio. We assign and assume identities automatically, unconsciously, reactively. So that's a bottle, and I am a bottle user. As I come in, we talked about this, the way I present myself to it, the way it presents itself to me. I assume a particular identity, I assign a particular identity to it. Now, is that its complete and utter identity? No, but that is how it affects me, how I respond to it, and it is how I am being shaped, how aspects of me are being brought into the foreground while other aspects are being left in the background. I am a teacher, you are students. I have assumed that identity, I have assigned this identity to you, right? And I'm conscious of it now, obviously, because I'm speaking of it, but it is happening automatically. You're doing this all the time with the objects around you, with the people you're encountering, with the events you meet. You are assigning identities, you're assuming identities. And this is part and parcel of course, we've been talking about this, about how the whole religio process works. But for the Stoics, and this is the point, what's un-Socratic about this is this co-identification process right, is happening almost always, mindlessly, automatically, and reactively. I give you an acronym for remembering it. MAR, to distort something and pervert its function. The degree to which this is happening mindlessly, automatically, and reactively is the degree to which our behavior is going to also happen mindlessly, automatically, and reactively. And we will make a fundamental mistake. So if you read Epictetus's Manual for Living, it begins with this, right? The core to wisdom is being able to know what's in your control and not in your control. And so according to the Stoics, because we conflate these two things together, because we conflate, we make an inflation and a deflation. We inflate how much control we think we can exercise over physical events, and we deflate and do not realize how much control we exercise over the meaning that we can give events. So the conflation produces inflation and deflation. And both of these are a source of great suffering, a loss of agency. All of this is costing us the loss of our agency. So, yes? So we tend to be inflated. We tend to overestimate how much we can affect physical events. And we tend to underestimate, this is the deflationary part, how much control we can exercise over the meaning of events. The problem with that is, right, what most affects us, according to the Stoics, most of the time, is the meaning of events rather than the events themselves. Okay, so how does that work? Well, it works in a sort of important way. It happens when we fail to recognize something that was sort of at the core of the cognitive revolution that started cognitive science, which is that we very often are responding to the meaning of a stimulus rather than to its physical properties. This is how the cognitive revolution was different from behaviorism. Behaviorism said what we respond to are the physical properties of a stimulus, and the cognitive revolution argued that no, we and most other organisms, at least higher organisms, respond to the meaning of a stimulus. So I can say fire, which is a stimulus with a certain set of properties. You can see yellow flame, which is another set of stimulus with different properties. You can smell smoke, another stimulus with another set of physical properties, and yet they can all cause the exact same behavior because they all mean danger to you. Okay? So, what I'm trying to point out is that this axial point exemplified by the Stoics is something that is also at the core of current cognitive science and cognitive psychology. Now, an important way of getting at this is to look at some of the practices, the spiritual exercises that the Stoics would engage in to try and bring this co-identification process into awareness. So one of the things they did was the view from above. And you can see this in Marcus Aurelius when you read his meditations. It's a practice you do where you try to imagine yourself. And notice how this is perspectival knowing. This is all about perspectival knowing. Internalizing Socrates, trying to create certain kinds of aporia in people. What I'm talking about now are exercises for transforming your perspectival knowing. So you transcend, you imagine yourself rising above and looking at the earth from above, both spatially above and temporally above. And what that does is that alters your sense of sort of how much time and space you take up, how sort of physically efficacious you actually are, how much your actions impact on others. And if you pay attention to just that, it's really sort of like, it's kind of, right? It can be very sort of like ego challenging, which of course was the point. To remind you, right, how much you can be overinflating the events in your particular local area of time and space, and how much you can be inflating your causal impact on events. But that's not the only point, because if we actually pay attention again to current science and construal level theory, when you get people to move to a higher level of construal, you make them more capable of insight, generally. They will generally act more abstractly. They will act more morally. They will pursue more altruistic principles. Precisely because that weakening of the blinding effect of egocentrism causes them to re-identify events and objects, and also re-identify themselves in relation to events and objects. Right? So the Stoics create the idea of cosmospolitan, although Socrates talked about it at the beginning. This is the idea that their polos is the cosmos. They want to figure out how to be, right, a person who is living in that kind of context. Another thing they did was the practice of objective seeing. So Marcus Aurelius says, now, although, I mean, he's saying this from a male perspective, so you would, I'm just going to quote him as a male. Well, I'm a male, but I'm quoting him as being a male. Obviously, you'd have to change the quote if you were female, but he said, consider sex as the friction of some areas of skin and the ejaculation of a sticky fluid. Now, when I say that to you, you kind of go, ew. And that's the point, because that's actually what's physically happening. But that, of course, is not what you typically think of when you think of sex. What you think of sex is all of the identities you're assigning and assuming, both your partner and yourself, and the events that's happening, and all of this is being into that event. Now, he's not a prude. He had children, which turned out to be a mistake. Rome was ruled best when it was ruled by gay Stoic philosopher kings. I kid you not. Because what happened is there was a bunch of Stoic philosopher emperors who were gay who would adopt, they would canvass the court, pick out potential candidates, educate them, and adopt the best candidate. And that process kept improving itself until you got to Marcus Aurelius, who was an astonishing individual. But he was straight, and he had a kid, and his kid was Commodus, and Commodus was a psychopath. So back to it, right? What Marcus Aurelius is trying to get you to do is separate, remember the fundamental difference between the event and all of the meaning that is being normally automatically identified with the event, with the process, okay? And then he does another practice. It's called premeditatio. As you kiss your son goodnight, and this is a real hard one. I've tried doing this, and this is really hard. As you kiss your son goodnight, say to yourself, he may die tomorrow. He may die tomorrow. Because that, of course, is true. And what Marcus Aurelius is reminding us is we have all of this meaning, and we forget that that does not, right, change the physical course of the universe. We're going to come back to this. Okay? So the Stoics started to engage, and then the fourth thing they did is they got you to pay attention to how, like, the logic of your own internal dialogue. And that's this. How so they concentrated a lot on pay careful attention. They had a name for this, prosos, careful attention to how you're making judgments, how you're assigning meaning things. Try to get into the habit of constantly paying attention and using logic and reasoning, evaluate. Is the meaning, right, appropriate, well calibrated, right, to what needs to be done in this situation? Now we'll come back to how they decided what that means in a bit. Okay? But I want to pick up on this because what the Stoics are revealing, I think, is something deeper. And this was sort of me. So the Stoics are explicating sort of a core idea here that we've been talking about throughout the course. Right? And what you should know is that Stoicism, the works of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, are explicitly cited by Beck when he invents cognitive therapy, repeatedly. Almost all of the cognitive behavioral therapies go explicitly and directly back to Stoicism. Okay? All right. Prososh. That's P-R-O-S-O-C-H-E. Okay? So the point about this, right, what's going on here is a fundamental principle. And what this is supposed to produce is prochiron, which means ready to hand. What that means is you're supposed to be practicing these exercises because having beliefs or making assertions isn't philosophia. Talking and even having beliefs doesn't matter. What matters is, can you take the theory and by practicing prososh, bring about prochiron. Prochiron means it actually becomes part of your fundamental framing, the way your significance and sacredness landscapes are being made in an ongoing basis. Only when it has got to that level, the level that the Stoics would call virtue, have you actually achieved philosophia. Yes?
It's kind of like the difference between a kratina and concept.
Yes, and it's supposed to ultimately be sophrosum, which I'll come back to. But thank you for that. All right, yes?
I'm just wondering, what do studies say about the effectiveness of this kind of either cognitive behavioral therapy or I don't know, Stoicism and
So, right. So the forms of therapy that have the most evidence-based claims to success are the cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapies. They do much, much better, evidence-wise, than other therapies. And there is increasing evidence that they can deal with anxiety and depression as well, or in fact, often it seems, better than pharmacological interventions.
over what time period is that? Like, is someone undergoing that kind of treatment?
There's controversy about that. So there is a movement on right now to have brief therapy, 16 to 18 weeks or something very minimal like that. I can't get into it right now, but I think there are good reasons to believe that that is wrong, that significant change requires a much more significant period of retraining because we're trying to get at very fundamental aspects of cognition. Okay, so let's take this forward and interpret it for our meaning crisis, because that has been done. And it will also make clearer a kind of perennial problem facing us that the Stoics are putting their finger on, and that Stephen Batchelor also claims is the core of Buddhism in your book, Alone with Others. Now, for reasons that are not clear to me, Stephen Batchelor, I met Stephen Batchelor. We liked each other. We got along really well. He cites Heidegger, which I think is ultimately right, but the person who's most responsible for this discussion of bringing the Stoics, and somebody we're going to talk about later, Spinoza, into the modern meaning crisis was Erich Fromm. So as you can tell from his name, he's German, and he's a psychologist and psychotherapist who was active in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s. So Fromm talked about existential modes. Existential modes are the ways in which we are assigning and assuming identities. That's what an existential mode is. It is a particular way in which we are instantiating religio, in which we are creating that agent-arena correspondence and connection. So Fromm argued that there were two fundamental modes. Each mode is organized around two fundamentally different kinds of needs. So there are what he called being needs and having needs. And the distinction between being and having was plausibly discussed by Heidegger. I don't know about that. Gabriel Marcel, the person who talked about ontological mystery, does make a clear distinction between these. Anyways, in Fromm is influenced by Heidegger and by existentialism, people like Marcel, but he is also explicitly and repeatedly, he acknowledges, influenced by the Stoics and influenced by somebody who is deeply influenced by the Stoics, namely Spinoza. So what Fromm says is that having needs are met by having something, by controlling it, by manipulating it, often by controlling it to the point where you consume it, like air, like water, like food, or at least it has to be reliably close to you, like your shelter. And there's things that are sort of on the border between consumption and close to you, like medicine, right? So you have these having needs. And so these are needs that are, right, met by control, through manipulation, right? What they require is an ability to solve problems, to achieve goals. In this sense, they require intelligence, as we've talked about it in this class. They lead to a kind of co-identification process, and that's what an existential mode is, that he called, influenced in connection with Buber, an I-it relationship. An I-it relationship is that what you're relating to, you're treating as an it. You're treating as a member of a category. So it's category membership, and then you are a manipulator. Right? So generally, health issues aside, because those are issues of consumption, you don't care if it's this water or that water when you're thirsty. Right? As long as they're both sort of equally cool and clear, one hunk of water is as good as another hunk of water for you. Right? So, you have this I-it relationship, you're manipulating things, things have a categorical identity. So this piece of chalk has a categorical identity to me. I'm only relating to it almost exclusively as a piece of chalk that I can manipulate, and if it's destroyed or lost, I can replace it with another member that is equally good, because all I care about is its category membership. This is an I-it relationship. Now, here's the thing, and this is where you can't put a Christian reading on this. There is nothing wrong with this. The having mode is completely appropriate for things that you must have. If you can't ultimately control and consume water, you're dead. If you can't control and consume air, you're dead. If you can't control and consume food, you're dead. And if we can't control and generate or consume each other in sex, we have that weird metaphor about it, yuck, right? Right? The species is dead, okay? So it's not that one of these modes is good and the other is evil. That's a Christian interpretation, right? These are the things of the body. No, that's not Stoicism. These are the things, these are the physical things that you don't have complete control over, but you need to have the most physical control you can have. Okay? Now, the being needs are not met by controlling or having something. They're met by developing and becoming something. Right? So, these are about development. It's not so much about manipulation as self-transcendence and growth. Right? Here, right, and Fromm is explicit about this, it's not about it's not about solving problems, it's about confronting mysteries. It's about paying attention to how you're framing things and the meaning of things. So it's more about confronting mystery, or at least meaning. So we'll say confronting meaning and mystery. Insofar as you're doing that, that you're not using your intelligence, you're using your reason. Because reason is the process in which you use your intelligence to determine the best way to use your intelligence. Where you're not automatically directed towards solving a problem, you're stepping back and doing second-order thinking. You're critically evaluating the meaning-making and the framing. That's reasoning. You don't have an I-it relationship, you have an I-thou relationship, where you have expressive identity rather than categorical membership, to use a phrase from Collingwood. I'll come back to this in a sec. And you're not a manipulator, right? You're in some sense a partner, a participator. Okay, so let's go back to categorical membership, right? You shouldn't treat everything as a categorical membership. Okay? So, for example, right, my girlfriend Sarah, she would not be pleased if I said this. Sarah, the reason I'm with you is because you remind me of every other woman I've been with. I find that I can easily manipulate and control you to satisfy my needs, and that if I were to lose you, I could easily replace you with another woman. This is not going to do well for my relationship, because she does not want me to assign that identity to her or to assume that identity for myself. Instead, she wants me, and I want to, afford the expression of who she is more fully and specifically. Namely, right, I ultimately treat her, and I mean this in a positive sense, I treat her as a mystery, not a problem to be solved, but as something that will constantly transcend my framing of her. I will frame her, but because she is a self-transcending kind of being, she will constantly transcend whatever framing I have. She will grow, and I will grow as she grows. And hopefully, I will allow her and afford her, be vulnerable enough that she can also do that with me. And so I'm not manipulating, we're partners, and we're participating in a process of mutually afforded self-transcendence, self-expression. But I can't have that relationship to this chalk. Well, I'm trying to do this lecture. I'd have some sort of weird mystical experience about the chalk, and I couldn't do the lecture. Okay? The Frantics, they're a Canadian comedy troupe. They had a really good thing about how inappropriate the being mode can be. So it's a typical castaway, right, sort of scenario. There's obviously been a shipwreck, and there's all these people wearing, naval uniforms, and they've washed up on the shore. And the captain says, Johnson, you all right? Smith, yes. Jones, yeah. Everybody okay? Yeah, we're okay, Captain, we survived. And the captain says, okay, Johnson, get some food. Smith, look for some water. Jones, try to make some shelter. And Johnson says, but Captain, what about the life of the mind? I think we should first build an art gallery. And Jones says, not a gallery, an astronomical observatory. And they get into this, like, no, that's not the time, right? That's not the place. Now, I'm using the reverse, and we find that funny because it is very rare for us. Fromm's point is we engage in the opposite modal confusion. Modal confusion is when you use the wrong mode for the needs you're trying to satisfy. Okay, so let's talk about being needs. One of your being needs is to become mature. You have to self-transcend and self-transform to become mature. And notice how these needs typically are not self-terminating, if not, neurotically misidentified. The way so if normally your thirst need is self-terminating, you drink and it terminates. You're hungry, you eat. Now, of course, we can get psychopathological, and we'll talk about that in a bit, right? But the point is, your developmental needs tend to be much more open-ended. Most of you, I hope, don't think you're mature enough yet. I don't think I am. okay? I still catch myself acting immaturely. And it's a value to me in and of itself to be more mature, right? So you want to be mature. You want to become wise. You want to be honest, virtuous, right? You want to be in love. So these are being needs. These are needs that are met by becoming a certain kind of person. These are perspectival in that sense. Now, what Fromm argues is that we have, and he argues it for historical cultural reasons, what we have become is we have a growing tendency to try and meet our being needs within the having mode. So you need to be mature and you have a car, right? You need to be in love, and so you have, this is the language we use in fact, you have lots of sex. And so what Fromm says, and the reason for that, the reason why that's increasing is because we're in a capitalistic system that, right, wants to try and convince you with bullshit that all of your needs can be met in the having mode because that is the mode of production and consumption, and things are produced according to their categorical membership. This capitalism also drives to try and standardize the identity of things. Look at the two glasses. Styrofoam things right there and there. Why standardize things? Because if I can get everybody to standardize, then I can mass produce and I can get massive profits. So what's happening is he was one of the first people to talk about how everything is becoming commodified. Everything is being assigned a commodity, a consumer-producer identity, and everything is being given a standardized identity. And all of this is so that we are being taught more and more that the way you achieve your needs is through the having mode. Now, one more time, right? The having mode is not evil, any more than the being mode is intrinsically good. I gave you an instance where, like with the people washed up on the beach, where the being mode is inappropriate, right? What's wrong, according to Fromm, is modal confusion, because if we try to meet the being needs within the having mode, we will be frustrated. We will not actually achieve the needs. That frustration will impel us to try more and more to get what is being offered within the having mode, which will more and more, although it has the salience that grabs our attention, it doesn't have the reality that affords the development that we need. So what happens to Fromm is this cycles faster and faster and faster, and it becomes more and more filled with frustration, a sense of futility, and a sense that somehow we're all being conned, misled, deceived. Now, just to be sure that you're understanding, what biases might have, Fromm was a Marxist. He was deeply influenced by Marxism. He was influenced by the Marxist critique. But he is not a standard Marxist. He is a Marxist deeply informed by Stoicism and Existentialism. So, what Fromm what he thought, yes, Rachel? Very loudly, please.
I'm just wondering, how does that relate to how would you compare like cell phones, for example, because it's not necessarily like that the need is biological, but being able to increase your communication with others, increases your dialogue, which would be able to help you to some transcend according to some philosophers.
So, I didn't hear the first thing you said. Did you say self-confidence?
Cell phones, like phones.
Oh, cell phones. I was trying to process that in terms of self-confidence, and I was like, what? Cell phones. I mean, well, I mean, we literally have to produce and consume information. So there are aspects of information is, right, and that's why, of course, we're talking about it in connection with the course, right? There's information that we need to actually ingest and make part of our minds in order to make our minds. But there's also information that we need because it affords the self-transcendence and the self-transformation. Now, the thing about the cell phones is that, right, what Fromm would ask us is, what effects is it having on how we identify ourselves and how we identify situations and events in other people? Is it tending to make them more categorical, Or is it tending to make them more sort of open to us in this way? Now, this is an open question right now about whether or not what the sort of effects on consciousness and cognition and character of hypertechnology and social media. Generally, the claim that you made, and if some of you might have read the zombie essay, isn't that well borne out by the data. So, as you may know, we're experiencing, and this is part of the meaning crisis, we're experiencing a loneliness epidemic. Loneliness is massively increasing. People are feeling fundamentally more and more disconnected. And what you can look at is you can look at the effect of people who are significant social media and social technologies consumers and see what effect that has on that overall trend. And it has a very small, it has a measurable but small amelioration effect. So it's slowing down the epidemic, but not by very much. So for all of our connectedness, we're not doing much to, right, get the being needs that we need. Because loneliness, the need that is being met in loneliness is you need to be with other people. You just need to be with other people. You don't need anything from them. You don't need to eat them, right? You just need to be with other people, okay? Because we make each other into people by our interactions. So I think the thing is, it can make a difference. I think that's clear, but it's not making too much of a difference. I think that's also clear. Does that answer your question? So, modal confusion. And what happens is if this is happening mindlessly, automatically, and reactively, modal confusion is more, we are making ourselves more and more susceptible to modal confusion. As we practice the Stoics' practices, what Fromm came to call the art of being, learning the skills of transforming consciousness and cognition so that you can recognize in your life, realize in your life, prostos and prochiron, this difference, and train yourself to meet the needs in the appropriate existential mode, you can bring about a clarity in response to the modal confusion. And he says that requires a lot of work. That requires a lot of Stoic and Socratic work because your culture is actually pushing you in the opposite direction through very pervasive bullshit that depends on keeping you in a state of modal confusion. Okay, now, what's interesting, right, is that this points to a perennial problem that we face in perspectival knowing. Now, there's going to be cultural impact on it, cultural variations on it. But look, the Stoics and, you know, the modern West are two different cultures in some important ways, and yet this threat, we're always under the threat of modal confusion. There is always the possibility that we can fall into modal confusion, and that will lead to a fundamental disruption in our religio. It will cause a kind of personal or collective domicile because we are seeking a kind of connectedness and development that we are not getting. So what Stoicism was an attempt to create a sacredness landscape, a set of practices, a set of stories, a set of exemplars, but, right, a mythos. So they would collect stories about Socrates and other great, you know, philosophers. They would create symbols. Socrates himself became a symbol that you participate in and, right, internalize. They created a mythos for the religio process itself, because that's what they are focused on, right, in order to address modal confusion as a perennial perspectival problem. We can have the wrong perspective. We can have the wrong mode for the needs that we're trying to meet. And so what Stoicism points to is a couple of things, right? It points to the fact that people can create new sacredness landscapes through rational reflection and community building, because they built communities that addressed a meaning crisis that was civilization-wide at the time. And Stoicism grew very powerfully. By the time of the Roman Empire, right, it is becoming pervasive. it is only eventually overtaken by Christianity, largely because Christianity also absorbed a lot of Stoic ideas. So the Stoics created ideas like universal human rights, the brotherhood of man, the brotherhood of all human beings, the idea that government should behave rationally and virtuously. These are all Stoic principles. Okay, now, I want to go on because I want to try and outline some other perennial perspectival problems. These are problems we perennially face because we are perspectival creatures. We are creatures that are invested in perspectival knowing, that are capable of self-deception, self-transcendence. Creatures basically that are children of the actual revolution. We face perennial perspectival problems. And one of the arguments I'm making is, right, if your sacredness landscape breaks down, these problems become more and more prevalent, and you have fewer and fewer resources to address the perennial problems. So the idea is, what's happening in the West is historical factors have completely undermined, we talked about this last class, our sacredness landscape. That has exposed us more and more to these kinds of perennial problems. Prime example, our initial example, is modal confusion. There are other perennial perspectival problems that we are now more and more exposed to because we do not have a salience landscape that trains us, right, in how to address them. Does not protect us from the domicide and does not teach us how to expose ourselves to mystery and self-transcendence and the numinous. So what are some of these other perennial problems, right? Well, we're going to talk about that in a sec, but let me just make sure you got the point that I just made. Any answer to the meaning crisis is going to have to be an integrated system of psychotechnologies for addressing the perennial problems. And and it's going to have to be, it has to be integrated with, right, something that gives us an alternative worldview that deals with the historical factors. And that alternative worldview and the psychotechnologies together can potentially make for us a new sacredness landscape. The thing I think that it gives us a systematic set of psychotechnologies for dealing with the perennial problems is Buddhism. The thing that can give us a way to address the historical factors is cognitive science. And the interaction between them can help reconfigure for us a sacredness landscape for addressing the meaning crisis. Okay, can I erase the board? Okay, so obviously the most perennial threat of all is the one that all of the other ones sit on the top of, which is the threat of domicide, the threat of, of just losing that sacredness landscape that protects, enhances, and enriches religio. Okay? But modal confusion is a particular version. All of these are particular versions of how domicide can take root in us. Okay? So the first is modal confusion. Right? The Stoics had one more I want to pick up one more sort of aspect of this. And then I think that would be appropriate to take a break, and then we'll move on to the other problems. And then Fromm talks about this too. But the Stoics concentrated on even a deeper issue. Modal confusion was primary, but a deeper one that has to do with how we identify assign identities and assume identities has to deal with basically the relationship to our own mortality. Now what's interesting, if you do research on mortality salience, if you trigger people by priming them with words like death, 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 you're finite, soon you won't exist, death, death, finite, you won't exist at some time, you're finite, you're limited, eventually you'll be gone, people start to change. Like if you prime them, right, this way, they become very conservative, they become very attached to their worldview, and they want that worldview to be absolutely true. So they They do exactly what Geertz predicted they would do. They go towards worldview attunement, and they do this creedal thing. They try to make it absolutely metaphysically necessary that that's the truth, and they try to identify with it. But if instead of just priming people, you get them to do what's called death reflection, and you say, imagine yourself dying. What would happen to you? So instead of thinking it third person, right, in personal propositions, right, try to go first person perspective, and you're actually dying. What would matter to you? What thoughts would occur to you? What would you consider? People have exactly the opposite response to death reflection. They tend to become compassionate, altruistic. They tend to become oriented towards other people. They tend to become open to new experiences. Okay? Now, this is an important thing. The same fact about their mortality, right, is being presented to them, but depending on how they frame it, they can either ossify or it can provoke a kind of growth and altruism. Yes? Thomas, as loudly as you can. I know you're filled with parasites.
How does this relate a lot to the opponent processing sort of effective integration and differentiation for sort of mutual modeling effects?
I think so. I think part of what the first person perspective thing does is it gets you out of a kind of epistemic, we'll talk about this in a bit, an epistemic third person kind of, right, framework to a first person existential kind of framework. The kind of self-transcendence are different. And well, that's what I'm going to actually get into arguing when we talk about absurdity. So maybe if you wait till then you can bring your question up again. Okay, so what the Stoics were on about is what is the fatality of all things. I mean, mortality is only part of your fatality. Okay? In fact, that word has become so associated with death for you that you have forgotten what it actually means. This actually doesn't primarily have to do with death. What's the core of the word fatality? Fate. The fatality of all things is the fact that we tend to assign a narrative identity to things, and we tend to assume a narrative role. I have met this wonderful woman. I am finally met somebody that I think could be my lifetime partner. It's fantastic. I get hit by a truck. Truck doesn't stop because, oh, John's in love. Laws of physics bend. My narrative momentum has very little causal impact. The narrative momentum is huge inflation, but it actually has yes, I can affect some people around me, but the large course of the universe is largely untouched by the huge meaning that is occurring right now. Right? And so for the Stoics, what happens, and this is why when you kiss your son goodnight, you say, he may die tomorrow. They recommended find a dish you really like and break it. Find a book you really like and give it away. Right? To remind yourself of the difference between the meaning and the thing. And what happens, according to the Stoics, is we have adopted the wrong kind of identity. Now, you may want to criticize this, and the Christians are going to, but we have a horizontal narrative identity. We think of our existence, our identity is largely in terms of a story that is unfolding through time. And according to the Stoics, right, what we're pursuing is we're pursuing this attempted completion of the story, when of course the universe is not going to come to completion. And the universe is, and they don't quite say it this way, but this is what I could sort of put in their mouth, and I don't think they would ultimately disagree with it. You can't have a complete or final meaning or religio. For the Stoics, and this is explicitly what they do say, you want a religio that lets you constantly flow with the flow of the universe. You want a religio that is rationally evolving with the changes in the universe, not trying to bring a story to completion. Right? So instead of living vertically, instead of having that horizontal identity, and Batchelor talks about this too, again in connection to Buddhism, which is why many people see connections between Buddhism and Stoicism. This is how you should try and identify. You should try and create a vertical identity rather than a horizontal one. Instead of you thinking of yourself as a story with which you should identify, you should think of yourself as a function of self-transcendence. What you should identify with is your capacity for self-transcendence, your capacity for self-transformation, your capacity for being virtuous. The thing that ultimately most matters to you is your meaning making. And the thing that you ultimately can most control is your meaning making. And wisdom is when you bring those together and properly cultivate a cognition and a character so that you are identifying with that capacity for self-transcendence and the cultivation of virtue, for rationally, meeting your needs as they best can be met by deeply and consistently distinguishing between the events and the small control you have over them and the meaning and the large control you have over it. That's what wisdom is. Wisdom is what I ultimately am is this freedom, this inner freedom of self-transcendence, of self-transformation. And if I can properly cultivate a fulfillment of my being needs through self-transcendence, I will reach a kind of completeness, a peace in my life, an ataraxia, inner peace. Remember that this is an idea obviously from Plato. And avoiding modal confusion is obviously influenced by Plato's ideas of avoiding inner conflict, right? I'll get an inner peace. The Stoics ask you to imagine this. Imagine if I gave you a situation in which all of your narrative needs were your career comes to completion, you raise your family, you finally get the lowest possible score you can in your golf game, right? You have all the best meals you've ever wanted to have in your life. You've had so much wonderful... I give you, and this has been done in literature, there's various versions of this. I give you a kind of immortality, and then you get to a place, right, where you're going to move on to, your being needs. You're going to want to try and become the best you can. And then, think about you're actually in that state. You're actually in that state of a fullness of being. And what the Stoics say is, do you need to exist anymore after that point? No. And so the idea is, instead of waiting the 800 years that it will take to do that, why not try and structure your life so that perhaps right now, in this moment, by practicing the exercises, training attention and prosage, training your perspectival knowing and prochiron, you could realize that moment. You could realize that ataraxia, that complete fullness of being, this complete identification with your process of development and growth. Then, the horizontal identity loses its terrifying grip on you. You stop living according to the fatality of all things. You get a kind of freedom. That's what the Stoic meant. Stoicism is not about being tight-lipped when bad stuff's happening to you. The Stoics repeatedly describe that what results from their way of life is joy. Not pleasure, joy. Because joy is what you feel when your being needs are most met. Pleasure is what you feel when your having needs are most met. Now, we, of course, have confused them in our culture, which is unfortunate. because it helps perpetuate the modal confusion that the Stoics were trying to alleviate. But if you could have a fullness of being, a joyful ataraxia, then this loses its pull on you, according to the Stoics. And you are free from the futility and the frustration that comes from trying to live as if it is not the case that there is the fatality of all things, which of course is ultimately the case. Okay, so let's take a break. Come back at 2:40, and we will continue on with some of the other perennial problems. And some of you may be thinking, this sounds a lot like nirvana, and you'd be right. It's about the present moment that brings a complete release from the demands of the narrative way of being. All right, so I wanted to make something clear that perhaps wasn't clear. A couple things were said during the break. When I talk about the fatality of all things, what I'm talking about is that most things are taking place outside or independent from our narrative momentum. And death is simply one of the most fatal things. It's something that will happen, right, pretty much regardless of your narrative momentum. So that's how come death became associated with fatality, because it is a primary instance of the absurdity of the universe, the way it will act completely independently from, all of this narrative meaning and momentum that you have running. Okay, so that now brings with it another possibility, which is the possibility of absurdity. And then a deep version of that, which is horror. So I want to talk about the perennial problem of absurdity and horror. I'm going to also argue that, like modal confusion, it is a perspectival problem. It is a perennial problem that comes to us because of our perspectival knowing and our inherent capacities of self-transcendence and self-deception. So, probably the best person on the absurd is the work done by Thomas Nagel, who is also a pivotal figure, by the way, in the history of cognitive science. He's a pivotal figure, by the way, for doing work on perspectival knowing. He wrote a very famous article on consciousness called "What's It Like to Be a Bat?" Okay, and I won't get into that. If you want to get into that, you have to take Cog 250 with me. Okay, Nagel wrote a very important essay called "The Absurd." He then wrote also more extensively about it in a book called The View from Nowhere. The View from Nowhere. The View from Nowhere. And I'm going to try and relate these things together for you. And then I'm going to extend Nagel's notion of the absurd into horror, which I've mentioned to you before. I have a specific way of interpreting what is meant by horror. It is not just intense fear or sudden shock. And that's why there are actually just like no mystery novels are actually mystery novels, they're problem-solving novels, very few horror movies are actually horror movies. They're just startle and puncture movies. Okay? And I tend to find them really boring. So, absurdity. Nagel writes, and there's two, first of all, he spends quite a bit of time doing what philosophers do. He undermines our common sense explanations for absurdity very, very powerfully. He shows that absurdity is not produced by reasoning. He does this by showing that the arguments that people think engender absurdity are not valid arguments. So people will say things like, well, whatever I do after a million years. He points out that is a symmetry argument. That means whatever happens a million years from now shouldn't matter to you. Therefore, what people are thinking a million years from now doesn't matter to you. Now, none of you are going, now I feel better, which is Nagel's point. The point is the argument and the revelation that the argument is invalid isn't touching the issue. People will say things, well, I'm so insignificant and so small. And Nagel says, okay, I blow you up to the size of a galaxy. Is it better now? And you go, no. And that's the point. And what he does is he shows that absurdity, although we think it is the result of our reasoning, is not, because none of the arguments that are supposed to result in absurdity are valid arguments. They're actually very poor arguments. And if absurdity was just generated by those arguments, simply pointing out to you how poor the arguments are should alleviate absurdity from your life. And of course the point is, it doesn't. And what Nagel says, I think quite correctly, after pointing this out, with going through the arguments very extensively, is the arguments come after the fact. Arguments are an attempt to express absurdity. They are not the cause of it. And so he tries to ask, what is it the arguments are expressing? And he says, well, the way to get at that is to, instead of looking at sort of cosmic absurdity, let's look at everyday absurdity. Let's look at an event of everyday absurdity. And it'll have these elements in it of sort of, notice the language, by the way, and this is it. I chose some of the terms in the course to correspond to the sense of insignificance or futility. Insignificance, the lack of significance. So Nagel wrote the paper in the 80s. And the 80s, for you people, the 80s are a before time. It's before cell phones and personal computers. There was a time where when you owned a phone, it stayed in one place. Typically, your phone was like your dog. It was in your house with you, right? And if you wanted to use your phone or talk on your phone, you had to be in your house near your phone. I know it was a barbaric and cruel time. Right? We had just got fire. And so what that often meant is that people were not with their phones when people would call them, because this was another weird thing. People would do this. They would want to talk to you, because humans generally like to talk to each other. And what they would do, get this, is they would call you on your phone. And you would pick up your phone, and then you would talk to them for like half an hour, like a conversation. And nobody thought it was weird. You could just call somebody and say, hi, how's it going? And they'd say, not too bad, what are you up to? And you'd have a conversation. Now, if you call somebody, the first response is, what's wrong? Why are you calling me? Okay, so because people were more likely to call and people were more likely to not be at their phones, we had answering machines, right? And so you made a recording. So this is the situation. This is the 80s in which this is going on. So you have Peter, and Peter has been wrestling with this for weeks, and he has come to the decision that he's going to tell Susan that he loves her. This is potentially a pivotal moment in his life and in Susan's life. So he calls Susan, picks up the phone, he says, Susan, don't say anything. If you say anything, I won't be able to talk. I just have to tell you, I've loved you forever. And then he hears, Susan is not here right now. And you're laughing. Because humor is low-level absurdity. Now, sometimes it's low-level absurdity that's insulting or hurtful, but not all humor is, right? So humor involves trading between two perspectives that don't belong together. So the most sort of innocent kind of humor like that are things like puns, right? So here's a few to remind you of how it works. Don't leave alphabet soup cooking on your stove because it could spell disaster. I picked up a book on anti-gravity and I just couldn't put it down. Things like that. Okay, so there's two different perspectives being played off against each other. And the absurdity is the fact that there's a clash between perspectives. And the reason why you laughed at Peter is because there are two perspectives that have been put in opposition to each other. There is, and think about the Stoics, by the way, there's this huge perspective of, this whole romantic narrative and this crucial decision. It's this first-person perspective, and it's coming into the situation, and then there's the third-person perspective of an uncaring machine that's actually getting the message. And the two perspectives clash. And what Nagel argues is that's the core of absurdity. Absurdity is when there is a clash between perspectives, when we can't get the perspectives to be co-relevant to each other. Now, when it's small enough and we just skip between them, we can find that kind of pleasurable and we laugh. But if it moves up and becomes more comprehensive, then that clash between perspectives can become very threatening to us. So what Nagel points out is that we have a capacity for self-transcendence. And we've talked about this in this class. So here's the way I'm framing events. And what I can do, this isn't quite the same thing as Gabriel's Marcel's sense of mystery, but I'll come back to the connection between them that Nagel doesn't see. I can move to a more encompassing perspective than this perspective, right? And then I can, of course, do this. Now, Nagel points out, why are we motivated to do that? Well, you know this from the class. When I move to this perspective, right, I can see the biases and the narrowness of that perspective. I can liberate myself from its biases. I can take on interests and goals beyond that perspective, which of course is why I would then move to this perspective. And what Nagel says is when we're pursuing, as a methodological goal, objectivity, this is what we're doing. We're trying to transcend as much as we can so that we can remove as much of the bias as we can from our perspective. And then the goal of this, he says, is to get to what he calls the view from nowhere. This is a perspective, right, that is not located in any particular location, right? It's a view from nowhere. It is supposed to be completely removed from your biases and your particular idiosyncratic goals and perspectives, right? Now, what Nagel says is we can take this. He doesn't think we can ever perfectly get there. What he argues is that science attempts to move us as much as it can in that direction, right? Because what science is trying as much as it can to do is increase the plausibility of our claims by reducing as much as it can, right, the chances that our claims are based on bias and prejudice. Now, what Nagel says is the problem is I can get to a perspective up here, right, from which my actions down here don't seem to matter. Right? So, as I go out to the view from perspective, the concerns and issues that are driving me here and now in this context, as I move out, I lose that, and as I lose that, right, all of these motivations come to seem absurd to me because, right, there is no way in which I can, according to Nagel, reconcile my motivation and commitment in this perspective to the view I'm having from that perspective. So it drains my lived experience of its commitment and its passion. Makes it seem absurd. And of course, this is just an extended, cosmic extension of what was happening with Peter and his message to Susan. You're having this perspectival clash, right? Now, Nagel wouldn't quite put it this way, but, right, there's a tension that's being revealed in here, right? There's a tension within relevance realization. The more I move up like this, the more unbiased I become, the more I can't zero in on, right? As I lose the things that constrain and frame reality, I am going to find less and less things specifically relevant or salient because I am unbiasing my perspective. I am removing myself from a specific interactional location. So there's a sense in which that's to more and more expose yourself to sort of the combinatorially explosive expanse of the universe. But you don't want to not do that either because you need to engage in this kind of self-transcendence or you will be forever prey to self-deception. So we seem to be caught in a tension. No self-transcendence is like way too much self-deception. Too much self-transcendence, and we can expose ourselves to absurdity. So Nagel then I think makes a big mistake in his paper. He then says this is all about doubt, which for me is where he drops the ball. For precisely the arguments he has given in the beginning of the paper. He has given very clear arguments that absurdity is not an inferential belief process. It is a process of perspectival clash driven by, as he repeatedly says, our capacity for self-transcendence. Those are his words, not mine. And then he tries to understand it as an experience of doubt. But doubt is an inferential belief transforming process. It is the wrong diagnosis for the event. Absurdity is not an experience of doubt. And so he gets locked into, I think, and this will come back to some of the criticisms of Nagel, he gets locked into a purely epistemological attempt to solve it. If we could just get the right knowledge, the right sort of set of beliefs, somehow this would alleviate. And then he can't find the set of beliefs, and then he just sort of says, well, I guess we're doomed to absurdity. Okay? But I think there's an alternative available that comes from within Nagel's own argument, which is to understand this as a species of propositional knowing is to completely misunderstand it. There is no answer in the sense of a proposition I will give you that will alleviate absurdity, because that is not the kind of processing that is occurring to produce absurdity, given his own arguments. What is needed is a way of transforming perspectival relations, relations between perspectives, so that you do not experience the perspectival clash. Not a particular theoretical claim as the result of inferential reasoning. We keep trying this. I'm sorry, I'm going to express a bit of frustration. We keep trying this. This is the Cartesian move, and when Descartes tried it, it was brilliant, and it didn't work, and we keep trying it. We keep trying to turn the meaning crisis into an issue of doubt and belief. That's a mistake. Religio is not credo. I have sat through too many undergraduate courses in epistemology and philosophy where it's all about skepticism and whether or not we can have knowledge. And it's like, I don't care. I understand, criticism and, reflecting on our claims and trying to improve them. But the fact that this all might be an illusion, so what? Like, if I can't possibly know that, what difference does it make? You know what I should not pay attention to at all? Things that I can make no difference to. There you go, I'm done. I think that's a mistake. I think what Descartes was trying to do was he was trying to address anxiety over the increasing meaning crisis that he was seeing, and he misdiagnosed it as doubt, and that the issue was skepticism and an incapacity to get certain knowledge. And that, I think, is fundamentally wrong. Okay, so I've given you these arguments before, so I'm just going to continue. Other people have addressed this and tried to respond, but before we respond, I want to extend it beyond Nagel. This, of course, can trigger, right, the machinery of mystery. This ability to take these wider frames can make you, right, experience what Marcel talked about as mystery. One of the things you, of course, can come upon is the fact that you can't ultimately frame your own framing. We talked about this. You can't leap out of your framing, right, to say, oh, there's, right? You can't do that. As you move to these more encompassing things, one of the things you can get an awareness of is that, in a sense, there's something mysterious about reality. You can't ultimately frame it. You can't actually get to the view from nowhere, something that Nagel himself does admit. There's this thing, there's a sense in which you can always asymptote towards whatever reality is. That doesn't mean that we're trapped behind illusion. It just means that there's a mysterious aspect even to everyday existence. Here's the problem, right? When absurdity, this experience of a deep perspectival clash, interacts with mystery, you get horror. You get horror. You get a sense of a fundamental wrenching and of losing a grip on reality. It's not just that it's absurd, it's mysteriously absurd in a way that is constantly transcending your attempts to stabilize it. And that's horrifying. Your sense of your grip on things starts to fade. There's a thin little book, I'm ashamed, I can't remember the author's name. And he talks about this, and it's a book called Metaphysical Horror, and he talks about this kind of thing. So a very good horror movie is a movie that should make you question your grip on reality. That will introduce a clash between perspectives, your calm, sedate, everyday perspective, and some other perspective that undermines this one, sets you into a mystery that contains within it this clash between perspectives, so that you start to lose your grip on reality. So that's why good horror is very rare. What's interesting is why we like it. I don't have a good account for that. But it seems like there's a part of us that likes to experience it, at least aesthetically, perhaps to practice dealing with it. I don't know. Okay, so absurdity and horror. This perspectival clash and our capacity for self-transcendence and our capacity for reframing. This is about religio. I'm not going to be able to give you an answer in the form of a proposition. There is no knowledge. Even if I could say, here's the absolute proof God exists, that doesn't remove any of this machinery. How could it? What would it do for you? Because none of this perspectival clashing has gone away by telling you that, even if I convinced you it was true. Has this gone away? No. Has the mystery of things gone away? No. Has the potential for horror gone away? No. Well, God loves you. Great. Still horror? Yep. Absurdity? I got it. Okay? It's something else. Now, what's really intriguing is somebody I mentioned earlier who picked up on this. He's a near contemporary of Descartes. He's actually better at being logical and rational than Descartes. He's a better scientist than Descartes in many ways. He's at least more logically consistent than Descartes and more rational in Fromme's sense. He's deeply influenced by the Stoics, and he had a deep influence on Fromme, and that's Spinoza. Spinoza writes a book called The Ethics, because what he's concerned with is not, right, he is concerned with how to find the good life within a scientific worldview. And what he's going to do is use the most, logically, and it's modeled explicitly on geometrical proof, tight argumentation to try and address the Cartesian crises that we talked about, right? And what happens, and there's some really good books on Spinoza, there's lots of, what happens is you start to understand that, he writes and he gives you he'll give you definitions and axioms and then proofs and propositions. And he builds it. It looks very much like Euclid's Elements, right? Or it looks like Proclus's Elements of Theology, with this idea of trying to establish things geometrically. But you get that the point of the argument, right, isn't the conclusions that it comes to, right? That the method of the presentation is actually crucial to what he's doing. Now, this is a claim many people have sort of come to realize, right? Because Spinoza is trying to induce into you a particular state that he realized. And it actually happens. If you reading the ethics is not like reading Descartes, you just read it to try and get the arguments. Reading the ethics is a spiritual exercise. You have to go through it and go through it and go through it until your mind starts to be transformed by processing it. It's a very arduous and difficult thing to do, and it's very rewarding. And Spinoza reminds you about this when he says at the end, what I've taught you is very rare, very hard to do, but that's precisely why it's so excellent. Because as he says famously, all the excellent things are always the rare things. Okay? So what happens is, he says, you get to a state, which he calls scientia intuitiva. Scientia intuitiva. So this is, I mean, I don't like to translate it into the English because we are all corrupted by Romanticism, because it says, it means intuitive knowledge. And as soon as I say that, Wordsworth is now skipping through your mind and you're thinking all sorts of romantic things. And that is exactly the wrong thing to think about for Spinoza. Spinoza is the least romantic writer of all time. Okay? So what does he mean by scientia intuitiva? What he says is, right, what can happen, and this is what happens if you do the ethics, this will actually happen to you. And it's like, whoosh, it's this amazing experience. You're running an argument and you go premise by premise by premise by premise, and then you get to the conclusion. Oh, what? This is a very long, complicated argument. Premise by premise by premise by premise. Oh, there's the conclusion. And then what? And the ethics is this 200-page argument, premise by premise by premise. It has several hundred premises in it, and so you'll be reading Spinoza, and then you'll lose the thread, and you go, "What? How did I get here? Oh yeah, okay. Oh right. Oh, how did I get here?" And you go back, and you do this, and it's this huge process, and you're doing this, and you're doing this, and you're doing this, and then what'll suddenly happen is you get to what he calls scientia intuitiva. And it does happen if you persist. You suddenly see the whole of the argument in every premise, and you suddenly see how every premise fits into the whole of the argument. And you say, I can't do that. I can never do that. You do that all the time on a smaller scale. You do things like this. You see the letters in terms of the word and the words in terms of the letter, and you're seeing it at once. But that's because you've read and read and read and read and read. So that bottom up and top down, that local level and that global level are now completely interpenetrating in a dynamically self-organizing manner that you experience as a phenomenological unity. Think of the premises like the letters, and then a larger set of premises like the word, and then the whole argument is like the phrase, the cat. You see the whole of the argument as it disambiguates each premise, and then you see how each premise feeds into the whole of the argument. And what is also going on is that the arguments are building a picture of reality from the local level up to all of nature. And when you get this flash between the elements, the premises, and the argument, you also get this flash of scientia intuitiva between the local perspective and the cosmic perspective. And they're completely interpenetrating and completely self-organizing. That's scientia intuitiva. And when you get there, you're achieving the state of mind that for Spinoza leads to blessedness. Because it's notice, think of what he's doing. This is so freaking brilliant, right? Because what he's doing is he's bringing back Plotinus, but he's doing it in a completely materialistic, scientific worldview. Because what you have is a completely rational assent to something that transcends reason. And the result, he says, is a state of love. He calls it the intellectual love of God. God means all of nature seen through scientia intuitiva, this rational, mystical insight. And and listen to the language of the intellect. The intellectual love of God is this profound, right, valuing and joy in having the scientia intuitiva, having this summation of reason that goes beyond reason and and reveals the love for realness that was always at the heart of reason. And he says, the thing that the wise men will never endeavor to do is to get God to love him in return. It is completely this way. Right? It is a complete transcendence of an egocentric framework. Now, I'm showing you that because, first of all, he's contemporary with Descartes, right? And it meant we could have gone a different way, but we didn't, because he was Jewish. And he completely crushes the two worlds. There is only one world. There's nature as it's being created and nature as it's creating. There is only one world. And God is a name for appreciating that totality from the perspective of scientia intuitiva. But what he does is he finds a way of bringing back, right, the normative order within a Cartesian, mathematical, completely rational, completely logical, completely materialistic worldview. He brings back Plotinus. And then he brings back, he brings back the Stoics. Because it's the same. He says that your deepest need for being is this need, right, to realize, to be in contact, right, to be consonant with what's most real. And what scientia intuitiva does is it removes absurdity. Because you're not trying to get any final framing, because you can't. What you're trying to get, and you're not trying to get a stable place where you say, stay at this frame, because you shouldn't. What he's doing is trying to get you to have, right, a complete interpenetration between your largest perspective and your most local perspective, so that the possibility for absurdity is removed, and all you feel is an unfettered intellectual, which he means rational, love for God, for what's real. So he gives a way of responding that is completely alternative to Descartes' quest to find certain knowledge that we cannot possibly doubt. Spinoza doesn't go that way. He pursues an alternative, which I think we should pay more attention to, which is how do you respond to absurdity? Well, you address the perspectival clash issue that is at its heart. And what Spinoza shows is that one of the things you can use, like Plotinus argued you could do, right, to bring about that perspectival transformation is reasoning. Reasoning has a capacity to bring about a reframing and a transframing that can realize this. Now, of course, reasoning isn't the only way this can be done. There are other ways of addressing this perspectival clash. So, there's a notion in various strands of Buddhism, prajna, right? And it's very interesting that this notion, so if you look at the work of D.T. Suzuki, where he's comparing, is it Suzuki? Where he's comparing Zen to Zen mysticism and Christian mysticism, for example. He's talking about this. And what's interesting is he points out that what he thinks prajna, that's at the core of Zen, I'll tell you what prajna is in a second. He thinks it was discovered independently in the West, in the Neoplatonic tradition by people like Eckhart and others. So he doesn't think it's specific to Buddhism. And he quotes a line from the mystic Eckhart to try and convey what the experience of prajna is. And this is the quote from Eckhart. So Suzuki's a very good writer, right? He's trying to convey Zen Buddhism to a Western audience. And what he does is he finds something, of course, from within the Neoplatonic tradition, the tradition coming out of Plotinus, in order to try and explain it. And the quote from Eckhart is the following: "The eye by which I see God is the same eye by which God sees me." Now, for many of you, you're going like, that sounds cool, but like, what? That's just weird. Okay, if you read on, he also talks about, James Austin, I got to meet James Austin, which was really cool. In his book, In Zen and the Brain, he talks about the zero to infinity experience. Okay, so one of the things you can do, let's go back to mindfulness. Mindfulness. Let's talk about using attention rather than reason in order to try and realize prajna, which is very similar to scientia intuitiva, because Spinoza was deeply influenced also by the Neoplatonic tradition. That's why Spinoza is so important. That's why, if you don't read Spinoza, your life's a failure. Okay, that's a hyperbole, but Spinoza, I think, represents a very important alternative to the one we have gotten into. Right? So, remember in mindfulness, I can scale down my attention. I can step back and look at my mind and break it up into smaller pieces and step back and step back and step back. And I can in meditation, remember it means to move towards the center, I can keep scaling down and stepping back and stepping back and stepping back. And what that can result in is that can result in a state that's called the pure consciousness event. You can scale back so deeply that you're not conscious of anything. You're not even conscious of yourself. You're not even conscious of being conscious. You're just conscious. And before you think, I don't know what that means, I want you to answer my question honestly. I want you to put up your hand. How many of you are conscious right now? Put up your hand. How do you know that? And what did you do to know it? See, there's an element where you're not conscious by knowing anything. You're conscious simply by being conscious. You know you're conscious, and it's completely identical with being conscious. There is no distinction between knowing you're conscious and being conscious. The distinction collapses. Yes?
Would you say that Zen masters are constantly in this state?
Pardon me?
Would you say that Zen masters are constantly in this state?
No, I don't think they're constantly in this state. I think that they have experienced this state, the pure consciousness event. And this corresponds to what I think Austin means by zero. Because what happens here is you've completely dissolved down sort of an egocentric way of framing both reality and yourself. So I think that is clearly what is meant by zero. And this is like how God is looking into you, looking into your depths. But of course, you can also scale up, right? And what you can do is, right, you can have that resonant at-one-ment experience where you feel, and this is also often heard in Zen, right, and other forms of, you can feel one with everything. So I wanted to buy this t-shirt, I couldn't get it. It's called the Zen Pizzeria. This Buddhist monk goes into a pizzeria and he says, make me one with everything. Okay? So I thought it was a clear example of how pervasive the sentence, the phrase had become. That sense of being one with everything. So you're, again, this is again sort of beyond an egocentric framework. You feel like you've taken that cosmic perspective. You're one with everything, right? And this is where you scale up. So this is meditating down, and this is contemplating up. And of course, this is the infinity experience. That sense of like that what we were talking about with Marcel, right? Here you get to the mystery that you, right, like, a kind of mystery. You can't put this into words because you are lower than words. And here you can't put it into words because you are opening up to the infinity of things. That the fact that reality always transcends our framing of it. And we can more and more open up in contemplation. So, this is the eye by which God looks into you. This is the eye by which you look out to God. This is God looking into the ground of your being, your soul, if you will allow me to stretch a Christian word to cover something in Zen. And this is you looking out to the ground of being, to God. And for Eckhart, they're the same. That's prajna. Prajna is the zero infinity state. This is a state known as non-duality. It is neither the state of that innermost intimacy with yourself, nor the state of the outermost absorption into the universe. It is a synergy of both of those. It is a state like scientia intuitiva, in which this and this completely interpenetrate each other. You are neither at zero or at infinity, but you're neither, it's non-duality. The state is one that transcends both. It is what Apter calls a cognitive synergy. A cognitive synergy is when you're simultaneously doing two things that seem conceptually opponent to each other or opposite to each other, but you nevertheless integrate in your processing. You say, I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. We talked about one of the most pervasive instances of cognitive synergy is metaphor. In metaphor, you're simultaneously creating an identity and maintaining a difference between two things. You're identifying and differentiating. And that's how you complexify your cognition, how you produce an emergent new state of mind. This is the ultimate complexification, the ultimate synergy, the ultimate production of an emergent state of mind. That emergent state of mind is the state of prajna. That's what I think the Zen masters are in. Because that is the state that they seek, the state of prajna. Because this is the state that is the most liberating. Why? Because if you're in this state, you're optimally set for insight. Because you can break down the most vicious frames and open up to the most expansive frames that you need. You are going to be able to really be super adaptive to your environment. And that's why prajna means wisdom. And it doesn't mean knowledge, which of course is what the whole Zen tradition is dedicated to showing you. That wisdom, prajna, is not a propositional affair. It is not a knowledge thing. It is a realization thing. It is a perspectival state that will perpetually keep you free from absurdity and horror. Because now, look at, you've got not only what you have in scientia intuitiva, right? You've got the protection from absurdity, but you've also got, right, you've completely reappropriated mystery. Now, mystery is the state that affords prajna. That's how it's been internalized. That's been how it's been appropriated. Because the infinity is constantly counterbalanced by the zero, and the zero is constantly counterbalanced by the infinity. And it's like stereoscopic vision. You have your left field of vision and your right field of vision, and what your brain does is fuse them together, and you now see things in depth. You have this inward, intimate way of looking, you have this outward, absorptive way of looking, and they have been stereoscopically synergized, and you see something beyond both. And that is the state of prajna. And that is a perspectival state in which you are protected from perspectival clash, absurdity, and mystery has been appropriated into the very state itself. So you are also protected from horror. That's prajna. And prajna is a state that, right, that you can achieve through mindfulness practice, the cultivation of attention. Something very similar to it can be achieved through rational practice, scientia intuitiva. And so there is no reason in principle why we couldn't be practicing both together. See, what I'm talking about here, prajna is not an insight within a particular state of consciousness, like the 9-dot problem. In the 9-dot problem, you have this sort of state of consciousness and you have an insight in it. Prajna is an insight of your consciousness. The way in which it is making a significance landscape and a sacredness landscape is being changed at the level of fundamental framing. Now, the fact that we have convergence, I pointed out to you, between somebody in the Cartesian scientific tradition, like Spinoza, and some people in the Zen tradition, and D.T. Suzuki pointing out the convergence between things in the Zen tradition and the German Neoplatonic tradition, points to this being a perennial capacity for us, something that we can do to respond to the threats of absurdity and horror. So, we've seen there are ways of responding to modal confusion, which is a perennial problem. There are ways of responding to absurdity and horror, which is a perennial problem. But there are other perennial problems. And again, these are perspectival. If this matters to you, and I'm not claiming enlightenment or anything, but I have been practicing prajna practices for a very long time, and that state is realizable that I'm describing to you. For me, it is not just a theoretical claim that I've studied from other people. By engaging in 2.5 decades of practice, it is a state that I can realize. And that does not point to any special ability in me at all. It is open and available to you as well. Okay, the third perennial problem is taken from work by Vellman. Prajna is not the same thing as enlightenment, by the way. I'm going to argue that there's more to it than that. But I think prajna is a crucial element to enlightenment. And what I'm trying to show you is you can have a completely cognitive theory, cognitive scientific theory of prajna and of all of the components that go into enlightenment, so that we can have a cognitive scientific theory of enlightenment. And, I mean, hopefully this doesn't sound trivial or stupid to you now, or like a Hallmark card that a friend gives you. The response to the perennial problems that are 1/2 of the meaning crisis is enlightenment and how to realize it. Okay, the reflectiveness gap. So Vellman talks about this. And it's also a perspectival issue, and like the other ones, like modal confusion and like absurdity horror, it threatens our agency. So Vellman is responding to somebody you've already met. Work by Frankfurt. Remember, he's the guy who did work on bullshit. Frankfurt is very concerned ultimately with agency and with relevance realization, or as he says, the importance of what we care about, or how important love is to being a rational being. So many of the themes in this course are of course, Frankfurtian themes. And Vellman is responding to an argument made by Frankfurt, which you will, of course, recognize ultimately goes back to Plato. So Frankfurt says one of the deepest threats to your agency is impulsivity, just doing whatever you want. Because then you become, and of course he uses this to pick up on that, right? You become what he calls a wanton. And he's taken an adjective. This is sort of a slightly Victorian adjective, like wanton behavior, means sort of impulsive, like chaotic behavior. And the point that Frankfurt makes is that this undermines your agency because, of course, you have many different impulses. They are often in conflict with each other. They often undermine each other. If you try and pursue one long-term goal, a more short-term impulse will overtake you, etc. So what happens is unconstrained impulsivity actually destroys agency. So what Frankfurt says you have to have is you have to practice being reflective, right? You have to step back and reflect on, and this is of course Plato's answer to, you have to step back and reflect, and you have to try and create an inner culture so that they can mutually get along together and get to a kind of optimal coexistence. We've talked about all this before. So Frankfurt says, well, this seems to be the issue, sort of more, and then Feldman asks, well, does that mean that you should just be sort of more and more reflective? Is stepping back and sort of critically reflecting on your mind and your behavior, should you just keep sort of doing that, right? And then what Vellman says is, well, there's a problem, right? Because initially, as I move up the reflectiveness scale, I move away from impulsivity. Impulsive. And I start to gain more agency. So it looks like what I should do is keep moving this way. But then he says, that can't be right. Because he says what happens is, when I step back and look at my motivation, my perspective, I get this kind of effect. So here's the perspective I'm currently in, this perspective 1. And then what I can do is I can go back and take a higher order perspective on that perspective. And again, this is the same perspectival machinery over and over again. And I'm going to keep pointing that out to you. Okay? And notice how little we talk about this in our culture. We are so fixated on our bloody beliefs and propositions, we do not pay attention to all of this perspectival and procedural machinery. Now, what happens here is very interesting. So when I'm thirsty, let's say this is perspective 1. I'm thirsty, I want water. And so what happens is, right, I'm not actually aware of my thirst, I'm aware through my thirst. If you'll allow me, my salience landscape is, I'm experiencing it very thirstily. So watery things become more salient to me. Containers that might contain water become more salient to me. Noise that sounds like water. So, right, what happens is my salience landscape, right, shapes so that, right, water, solving, water-seeking behavior becomes more and more afforded. Great. Now, when I step back and look at my thirst, this point here is not motivated by thirst. I'm not looking at my thirst thirstily. I'm looking at my thirst, maybe, with curiosity, or with anxiety, or something else. And what that means is my salience landscape shifts. And my behavior is no longer so tightly, right, affording me getting water. What happens is I've sort of reduced my impulsivity to get water precisely because I have moved to a perspective whose motivational machinery is different. And then Vellman says, but of course, what I can then do is do this. And of course, you know what this means, right? I can, right, then take a perspective on my curiosity or my anxiety. And that perspective itself might not be curious or anxiety. It might be some other. And what he says you can do is you can disconnect yourself from your motivational machinery. Your impulsivity goes down, but so does your connectivity. You start to become disconnected from the machinery of your own motivational engagement and involvement with your environment. And he says, if you go far enough, you don't get more and more agency, right? You end up as this guy, Hamlet. And he says the part of the Hamlet is this great tragedy, right, about somebody who has, the point about Hamlet is he has reflective capacities better than everybody around him until he meets the gravedigger, who sort of twists him and makes fun of him. Like Hamlet can just outframe anybody. There are more things in heaven and earth than dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. You're such an insect compared to my reflective ability. Look at my huge and powerful mind. And that's, of course, what Hamlet does. Hamlet opens up what Vellman calls the reflectiveness gap. He keeps reflecting, and then he reflects on his reflection, and he reflects on how he's been reflecting about his reflecting. Meanwhile, people around him are going mad and dying. This is why it's such a great work of art. Because it brings out, again, this perspectival threat to our agency. And the tragedy that the rational reflection which we so prize can result in such an incapacitating dismembering of our agency. So you can get to a kind of indecisiveness. So agency increases and then it diminishes. But if I go this way, agency increases and the idea, I should just sort of sit here. But that's not right either. You don't want to be sort of moderately impulsive and moderately reflective. Because sometimes you need to be very reflective, like you're at a funeral. You should be really reflective. Sometimes you need to be really impulsive. There's a tiger. You don't want to be sort of, maybe a tiger is, tiger eats you, okay? So the Canadian solution of having a wishy-washy in-between is not the answer. Okay, it never is, because you've seen this before, right? This is an optimization problem, not an averaging problem. So Vellman talks about this, and he says, well, what's the answer to the reflectiveness gap? How do we address this? Is there a way of being that will bring this, a response to this? He says, well, what this gives me is involvement. And what this gives me up here is this gives me flexibility. A capacity to self-transcend, to self-correct. What I need is something that somehow brings the two together. Now, if I hadn't given you previous elements of this lecture, you would say, well, that's impossible. Those are opposites. They're different perspectival scales. But what I've tried to show you is you're capable of transforming consciousness and cognition in a way that can transcend these two, that can do a kind of stereoscopic integration of them. And Vellman actually proposes this as an answer. And he says that there's an entire tradition, a religion, a post-axial religion or philosophia, that is dedicated to solving this problem. And it's called Taoism. The Taoism was the set of psychotechnologies that arose to specifically try and address the reflectiveness gap. How can you get both the involvement and the flexibility? The self-correcting ability, but also the motivational engagement that you need. How do you get that? Now, interestingly, as many of you know, Taoism and Buddhism became integrated together. That's how you produce Zen. You integrate Buddhism and Taoism together, and that produces Chan, and then you take that over to Japan, and that integrates with the feudal culture there and becomes Zen. And it's some of the feudal militaristic aspects of Zen that I would ask you to question also, by the way. Anyways, what's important is that this way of talking, though, is also picked up by Batchelor in his discussion in Alone with Others. Because if you heard me mention before, Taoism is the religion of flow. Taoism is about trying to create practices and perspectives, actually perspectival practices and procedural practices that will induce flow as comprehensively as possible. Not in video games or this or there, but as comprehensively throughout your life as possible. Now, when it's interesting, and Batchelor is from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. He's actually now a post-Buddhist. We'll talk about that later. His most recent book is called After Buddhism, because he thinks that Buddhism is too encumbered by some of its historical elements to properly address the meaning, something like the meaning crisis. Or another way of putting it, which I sort of presented to him when we were in person, and he sort of said, yeah, so that's sort of, is that the interaction between cognitive science and Buddhism is going to produce something sort of post-Buddhist, which I think is what's already happening. So I haven't read After Buddhism yet, but we'll talk about some other books that he wrote after Alone with Others, especially Buddhism Without Beliefs. Notice the title, by the way, Buddhism Without Beliefs. Okay, so why am I bringing up Batchelor? Because while discussing overcoming modal confusion, Batchelor also describes the Enlightenment as something very much like the state of flow, which I taught you about at the beginning of the course. So the flow state, if you remember, is a state that seems to combine both of these elements. What you're after is a state, and when I say this word, you have to hear it as neither one of these two things. What you're after when you do Taoist practices like Tai Chi, is you're after spontaneity. Spontaneity is not impulsivity. We have tended to equate it with that. Neither is spontaneity mere sort of reflection or self-awareness. Okay? Spontaneity involves something that we've briefly talked about before. It involves your capacity for participatory knowing. It involves your capacity, right, for triggering the fundamental self-organizational nature of your cognition. Rather than driving your cognition in an ego-directed, egocentric fashion, what you can do is you can create states of mind that tap into the self-organizing nature of your cognition. And therefore, right, you participate in your mind achieving a certain kind of state. So, we talked about this a little bit last class, but a fundamental one is there's lots of things you can do to set up or improve the conditions for insight. You can practice driving your attention down and your attention up. But the self-organization that is an insight is not something you can directly do. What you can do is do the things so that the self-organization that is insight are more likely to occur. Right? So what you do when you're practicing, when you're learning Tai Chi, when you're teaching people Tai Chi, as an example, I've been practicing it and teaching it for like 25 years now. And you have to practice these things for a long time, right? So what you're doing from the very beginning, though, is you're trying to get people to, and this is often how I'll explain it to them. I'll say, I want you to move, but I want you to feel like you're being moved. So I'll give them like an opening exercise. So the opening exercise looks like this is the initial move, right? You're doing this, right? And so what I'll say is, well, imagine you're standing in a stream, and your legs are sort of sinking into the mud, the water's flowing around you, and this part of you is feeling insubstantial like the air. And as you inhale, I want you to move your arms, but I want you to feel like two air bubbles are rising out of the water and then lifting your hands. So although you're moving, I want you to feel as if you're being moved, because of course you are being moved, right? And then as you put your hands down, I want you to pantomime as if there's a bit of resistance as you push those air bubbles back under the water. And what you're training people to do, right, is you're training them to move, but also being moved. So what's happening is they're directing their behavior, but they're also opening themselves up to paying attention and becoming self-aware of what's happening in their movement. So Alex, can I use you for a second as a victim? Please. Come on, come here. Okay. So, right, so like in a typical martial arts situation, we often try to grab people's hands, right? And the problem with this is a tell. People have been doing this since he was a little kid. So he knows what to do. He knows what to do. And if we're going to wrestle. But if his hands are here like this, and I do that move, that fight's over. Now that was the move I did like this. But because I've been practicing it for a long time, I can move very rapidly, but also with a lot of awareness and flexibility. So if I can hit him, I can feel how he's holding his arm at all times, right? Okay? So you can just feel how people, see how he's carrying his weight here, right? It's like jazz. I'm doing things, but things are also coming out of me. There is both deep involvement and deep creativity, which is why fighting somebody who's been practicing Tai Chi for a very long time is very dangerous, because it's like fighting a jazz musician of a martial arts. So, for example, I've seen somebody who knows a lot of Tai Chi just demolish somebody who knows a lot of karate, because the karate as you get far enough in karate, it turns over to being an internal art. But the internal arts emphasize this. Thank you, Alex. Thank you. Yeah, let's give him. Okay, so this is known as Wu Wei. Wu Wei, not forcing. And you're getting that in the book you're reading by Varela about ethical know-how, that kind of thing, right? That's what is meant by spontaneity. It is the state of Wu Wei. What you're learning is, right, you're learning this state, this way of being that, again, that synergistically transcends impulsivity and reflexivity. So when I'm sparring with people, it's like the capacity for self-correction is like I'm sorry, this sounds self-promoting, but it's impressive. I'm like, whoa, where did that come from? But on the other hand, there's speed and involvement and a deep sensitivity to what's going on. You're getting both. And what you get into is you're getting into a state of flow, because that's exactly what flow does. Flow has this tremendous capacity. And what I want to try and show you is sort of the two aspects that are in flow. Now, this goes to work that recently, that's going to be published this year in the Oxford Handbook of Spontaneous Thought. Work that myself and Leo Ferraro have done on flow as a prime example of spontaneous cognition. One of the things we argue is, well, what's going on in the flow state? So I'm just going to try and use 10 minutes to talk about this. So I can't give you the full argument. I give the full argument elsewhere. You take 370 with me, Psych 370. But think about what happens, like what kind of situations engender the flow state. Remember, you want the demands to, this is what Csikszentmihalyi showed. You remember we talked about this? The demands to be just beyond your skills. So you're sort of having to use your skills and stretch them a little bit to fit the situation, right? You can't just assimilate the situation to your skills. You have to accommodate, the skills have to accommodate the environment to some degree. There's this dynamic thing. So what happens is, right, the following. Think about some other things, like for example, when you're doing Tai Chi and moving, you form a move and then you break it. You have to break that frame, and then you have to make a new one, and then you break that. You're learning this with me right now. You know what I'm talking about, right? And so, right, it's the same thing when people are doing other things that create flow. Remember I said the thing that makes no sense unless it's for engendering flow, which is rock climbing, which is like some sort of Greek torture. You climb up the rocks. It'll be hard. It will be painful. You might fall down and die. And once you're at the top, come back down and pay other people money to do it. Okay? So if you talk to, what happens is it tends to engender flow. Now try and think about it, both in Tai Chi and in rock climbing. It's almost like what's happening is I'm getting impassed, I'm getting blocked, I'm getting locked into a particular frame, and then I have to break it, and then that gets me to a new place, like in the form. I have a frame, and then I break it, and then a new frame, right? And what I'm doing is I have a frame, and then I break it, and then I move to a new frame, and then I break it, and then a new frame, right? I'm at the right rock, like I impasse, and then I adjust everything, very perspectival, because I have to adjust my body, not just my thoughts, and that allows me to go to another place. And what it's like is it's like this. It's like I'm having a moment of insight that is then a little aha moment, and like things, right? And then that primes and affords another moment of insight, and another moment of insight, and another. And instead of impassing, those things that could become impasses, they're being dealt with as challenges and demands. And what I'm doing is I'm having a cascade of insights, and I'm taking that aha moment, and it's getting extended into an extended aha. And that's why you have the features that you have in the flow experience. You have the supersalience, because that's what you get in insight. You get that sense of discovery. You get that sense of participation and oneness, because it's an instance of ongoing participatory knowing. Flow is an extended insight cascade. That's why it has all this creative flexibility to it. But flow is also something else. And the two things are linked together. So Arthur Reber did a lot of work on what's called implicit learning. Implicit learning is your ability to pick up on very complex patterns without knowing how you do it. So what he did is he would create what are called Markov grammars. These are just artificial rules for how you can pair numbers or letters together. Your rule might be you have to have two vowels. You can't have more than one consonant in a row. You have to have two numbers. And so, you'd have to be something, you'd have to have a string like this, A, 1, 2, T, something like that. What you do is just create arbitrary rules, and then you create arbitrary strings. And what he did is he gave people these strings, just showed them all these strings that had been generated by the grammar. And people are sort of looking at them and looking at them. And the strings are usually like 7 or 8 letters long, so you can't hold them in working memory. So you do this, and then what you do is the following. In the next part of the experiment, you give people a bunch of new strings. Some of the strings have been produced by the grammar, and some of them have not. So some of them follow the rules that the previous strings followed, and some of them don't. Do you understand? And what people have to do is tell you which of the new strings belong with the old strings. And most of you think, I can't do that. And what's really cool is you can do this well above chance. Well above chance. What's interesting, if you ask people how they do it, they'll say one of two things. I don't know. Or they'll give you a rule they claim they're using, and that rule, if they were to use it, wouldn't actually produce their performance. So they either tell you the truth, or they confabulate. They think they're doing something that they're not actually doing. If you give people the same task and say, I'm going to give you these strings, try and figure out the rules, so when I give you new ones, you'll be able to identify the proper ones. You know what happens to people's performance? It degrades. It goes down dramatically. It goes down to chance. Okay. This seems to be, and this is what Hogarth argues in 2006 in his book on educating intuition. Intuition seems to be the knowledge you get from implicit learning. What Reber discovered is implicit learning, your ability to pick up on complex patterns in the environment without knowing how you do it. And intuition is the kind, I'm sorry, this destroys another romantic dream. My intuition, right? Your intuition is the result of implicit learning. This is why you don't know why you have the intuitive hunches you have, where they come from, because they were produced implicitly without your explicit effort or knowledge or any kind of ego-driven behavior. Now, this, by the way, probably explains most of our psychic abilities, that we can pick up on complex implicit patterns without knowing how we can or how we did it. What's interesting is the problem with implicit learning is exactly its strength. This will sound very Zen. Your greatest strength is often your greatest weakness. Okay? Implicit learning picks up on any complex patterns in the environment. Why is that a problem? Because many of the complex patterns in your environment are not causal patterns. They're correlational. So you'll get all kinds of intuitions about correlations that aren't actual, that aren't causal patterns. So the very thing that makes your intuition powerful also makes it perilous. So, what should you do? Hogarth's book, Educating Intuition. How do you improve it? Well, you can't try and replace it with explicit processing. When you try and replace it with explicit processing, you just degrade your performance. What can you do? Well, Hogarth says what you can do is set up the environment in such a way that you're doing something that is sort of analogous to what we do in experiments. Experiments are how we try to distinguish causation from correlation. Well, how can I set up the circumstances for implicit learning so that my implicit learning machinery will go for causation rather than correlation? Well, he says what you should do is make sure that you're getting clear signals, that the feedback is timely, very tightly coupled to what you're doing, and error really matters. If you make a mistake, it really matters. So clear signals, no ambiguity, right? Tightly coupled, right? Your interactions and the response are tightly coupled, and error matters. So those are the features that will really improve your implicit learning. Here's what should freak you out now, and this is what Vervaeke made an argument about. When you ask Csikszentmihalyi, what are the features that also are needed to trigger flow, he says, clear signal, tightly coupled feedback, and error matters. The very things that trigger flow are the things that improve your implicit learning and make your implicit learning, right, attached to causal patterns rather than correlational patterns that connect you more to reality. So what flow is actually doing, right, is in an integrated fashion improving your insight and improving your implicit learning's ability to zero in on the causal connections. That's how it's enhancing your agency so much. Anything that's going to make you a more insightful problem solver while improving your ability to pick up on complex causal patterns is going to massively enhance your agency. Now, of course, flow can be, and Alex, you're doing some work on this, right? Flow can be misappropriated and hijacked like anything else, right? Because anything that's adaptive, of course, can be the source of addiction. But the point I'm trying to make is, flow is a very powerful way in which we can train spontaneity that gives us both the deep involvement, the connectedness to reality, and the reflective capacity for self-correction, the creative, insightful aspect. And you can cultivate this. And what Taoism tries to do is, unlike video game addiction, which Alex is writing about, that locks your flow machinery to a specific irrelevant context, Taoism was a set of practices that tried to get you to expand as many of the domains of your life as you could, expand your capacity for flow into as many domains as you possibly could, so that all of life eventually becomes a flow state, which again is how Batchelor describes the Buddhist concept of enlightenment. So there are sets of psychotechnologies that can address the reflectiveness gap by teaching us how to cultivate wu-wei, spontaneity, and flow. Next class, we'll take a look at some of the more of the problems, two more of the perennial problems, and then we'll turn to address the historical factors. Thank you for your time today, guys.